Hello again and welcome to the program. I am Suren. With my following words, I would love to assure you that I'm not trying to brag about my own experiences, for it is not my interest to paint myself as a Mr. Fantastic. I'm only using my own experiences as an example within this context. It has always been the world who seems to believe in unbelievable traits on my part, but they are based apparently my imaginative self, which helped me to survive the harsh climate I've been subjected to. I have been always a very imaginative person since my childhood. That is probably why I could visualize, paint, and draw throughout my life. I've always been very artistic. Furthermore, I've learned the art by research and application styles of other artists' works and the way they have presented exclusive talents in their art, whether it be in watercolors, oils, pencil sketching, charcoals, or any other mediums, and also have learned how to create my own paints by using natural elements obtained from nature, including the earth. However, by additionally educating myself in the art academy, while in Europe, I became a professional artist, though painting any style and any subject from our very early days of my life on the planet. When I was a child, I have been considered as being extremely imaginative, but some prefer to call me just a simple liar. But I was not. When I was a mere youth, there have been people who believed in me as being who I was, somewhat as a young boy with unusual powers and talents. Putting my hands on watches that did not work for a very long time, or gramophone players that they could use, I made them start working, and they remained that way in working condition for a long time. There were times people asked me about what to do in regards to their not working television sets, and repair costs being very high at the time. They would ask me if I would not mind if I could perhaps just wish that television set to work, even over the phone, and they would start working although they have not been able to deliver any signals for a very long time. What was happening with me, and why was there an ability to make things work again? That's a question. I really could not enlighten you concerning this issue, and these could have been just coincidences or coincidences. On top of that, many people believed I was a natural healer, and that all I wanted to do was wishing them to be well, and they would indeed be well. It was not necessarily my magical self, and I really don't believe there was any magic involved. In fact, I grew up believing in no such things at all. I believe, as always, in science and provable facts, and repeatable experiments, and not just imagined things. But I cannot deny the power of imagination. When I have studied psychology and later psychiatry, I discovered my words being very effective in healing people's problems. But I was healing people only through science that I have learned about and not through magic. And I was very happy about studying psychiatry because that has given me an enormous amount of insight, significant understanding, and wisdom to know where I stood. As I matured and traveled abroad, I should say, I was surrounded by people who believed in my powers of being magical, but I have never considered myself a magician. And the most I could accept was, really, my whole personality, however. And the whole story I am talking about is a lifelong interest in people's well-being. Indeed, I was different, but that did not mean that I had very special powers, which I have discovered in my younger days. Even now, I believe that everybody has such powers and hidden processes, that they could do those things by themselves. I was only the facilitator and helping them to imagine. By doing so, they were triggering powers unknown and not yet researched or discovered into that we all have. Only some of us are able to see, but not all of us would accept. Our sciences are affected by the bias of the environment we live in. And thankfully, we had some scientists and discoverers who thought differently. And one of those scientists that I admired was Tesla himself. The other favorite of mine was Albert Einstein, and many others followed ever since. I believed in philosophy, meaning love of knowledge. Anybody and everybody could do just the same. I was not very special. I was very knowledgeable about things, and some even claimed that I must have brought that with me from a long time ago, before my birth. That's questionable. But what I have learned throughout the years, experienced or experimented, showed me that we all were born with similar characteristics, and that only to be discarded by our elders, our teachers, or even our parents, who too had fantasies. I have learned that fantasies and imaginations were a vital part of the human species. Without fantasies and without imagination, there could be no advancement, no inventions, no healing, nor any desire to live. Many today consider imagination still not being true, perhaps even a bunch of lies. Perhaps telling these sort of lies in imagination is, apart from being completely innocent without a wish factor to hurt anything or anybody, is a must in our lives, and those childhood imaginations should never be suppressed and destroyed in the process. When I was married to a woman who joined a cult, and her imagination has been directed into their own religious wish fulfillments and designs, or just simply the darkness of their own interpretations and their own style of explanations, full of untruths. However, they have never allowed any imagination, considering them to be a bunch of lies instigated by the mighty devil, only encouraging her to read the Bible and live by the Bible and believe in the end of the world. However, the end never came, and I don't think it will ever come, because the Bible was also a work of imagination. However, that's a different story. We will have to talk about it later. If I did not have this human attribute, the imagination and fantasy, I do not think it would be possible for me to work and support my own education. Indeed, I was different, but would never claim to be the one, nor feel comfortable talking about my own experiences alone. In regard to imaginations, some people accepted me, while others found me too unusual, trying to judge me according to their own limited understandings, and probably non-existent imaginations. Can you imagine how lonely the world could become if there were no imagination, no thinking in futuristic terms? How could we even imagine, visualize to create a facility for farming, facilities for building cities, let alone creating wonderful works of art that has taken a huge room in our earthian lives? And I'm glad that humanity has truly came a long way in imagining and creating some color in a beautiful world we are living in. One learns by living and imagining that we are conducting all our experiences, even our conflicts, after imagination and creative thinking. We fight as a whole humanity other people's imaginations, just considering them as the enemies. Would this be enough to tell one that it is based on nothing but a huge amount of imagination? However, my then partner, a long time ago, who joined that cult I made mention of, was unable to see the difference between imagination and actuality. She was so influenced that listening to radio or having a television set in the home was definitely the devil's tool that would take our minds from theocratic responsibilities of ours to mundane fables and worldly thinking. Therefore, no music, no entertainment, and nothing of the kind was allowed in my family home until we had to go our own ways separately. Children abducted and taken away to be looked after by that cult members. They all have been influenced by the feelings of hatred towards their father. That was me, with different opinions and colorful imaginations, and I have been labeled as the number one evil in the world. He will do us harm too, as thought in fear by the cult members, and I was thrown out of their supposedly righteous organization without even being a part of their team, or their group, or their organization, so to say, their race, which they considered as being the only human race chosen of God. If I had no imagination like everybody else, I could not survive it. I can assure you. Imagination has helped me to live on under all circumstances, and if I have helped a few people in the meantime, I'm absolutely so thankful, grateful, and happy for being different. I am sure there are many who are watching and listening to me like at the moment, or they may be biased, thinking that the whole thing is nothing more than a bunch of lies. Even recently, there have been people simply considering my ethnicity and my looks judged me as nothing more than a liar, because in their minds I had to be a liar and not as truthful as themselves, because in their own biases and not imagining minds, they could only judge and think of me being what they imagined me to be. There have been many people of this nature when I lived in Europe, particularly in Germany, For according to their imaginative but wrongly guided minds and imagined standards, I was an evil person. I was, in a word, different, and they, their own blanket out minds, called me by names which were not mine. I was the rejected of all people when I came to Australia, and once again I've been called a foreigner by some who had nothing more than bias. A ridiculous amount of opposition and bitterness without any reason whatsoever. Again, being an imaginative person, I found the science that I have studied and the art I have been engaged in have helped me survive. So, without bragging, hopefully, about my own self, I can assuredly say that imagination to me was vital. And I know some people in their jealousies or biases considered imagination as being nothing other than a bunch of lies. Sad. Let's make a little addition here and say that thank you for those who accepted me and not considering me as a liar, for that is an experience which has been very beneficial for me. I wish them the same understanding. Imagination is something that may not be true, but it cannot be classified simply as a lie. If humanity could not think and imagine things, just inventing more fiction instead, even science fiction, and considering it as complete nonsense and idiocy, as some religious cults would principally consider, what would happen to science, and indeed, what would happen to discoveries that we currently enjoy in our world? Alas, there are religious cults and cultures which consider thinking, especially in the scientific sense, perhaps as fiction. Fiction being as the demon infestation or no life after death. We don't exist. We are like the wind and we live on a flat earth. The lights, wheels, electricity being considered and dismissed as science fiction. What would happen to humanity of today? What would the world be like without fiction? Without fiction, we would have a bland, mundane, and a very grey world to live in, indeed. Fiction has given us inspiration and imagination. As Albert Einstein once said, it is better to have a good imagination than a good intelligence. And logic will take you from A to B, but imagination will take you everywhere. 30th April 2017. What would happen without fiction novels? Question mark. If you could create a fictional world, science fiction, fantasy, what would it be like? Question mark. Somebody wrote the following. It would be like that because I cannot think of alternatives, but I don't even have to be imaginative. I can just remember creation of such as the massive world in Hal Clement's Mission of Gravity or Larry Niven's Amazing Ring World. With every passing year, seems like a plausible science fiction world with intelligent creatures put in a tight envelope as our advancing understanding of the universe gets better. Venus had swamps, mustard deserts with breathable air, even jovial moons were not out of the question. When I was a child, the author writes, in the many science fiction novels I read, it was axiomatic that intelligent civilizations abound around other stars, and there were multi-star ones, maybe even a galactic civilization. There were no multi-galactic ones, though. Even then, there were limits or limitations. We have surveyed over 300 nearby solar systems, and not one of them appears to be able to support Earth-type life. If intelligent life requires Earth-type conditions, that is, not one of those solar systems resembled ours, not one. We once thought ours was atypical, a perfectly reasonable assumption that is, barred contradictory information. Now we have that information and it does not look good. I was really impacted by reading the non-fiction book Rare Earth. This is where people who belong for the wonderful science fiction universe of so many science fiction movies, even today, jump in and say, wait just a minute. We may know so little of the universe. Anyone who thinks worlds with intelligent life have to be just like ours, have no imagination, believe it or not. All we can be sure of is that they will not look or think anything like us. That is the most common attitude in the community of readers and viewers of science fiction. It gives rise to movies. And honestly, often movies I have enjoyed greatly, like The Fifth Element or the Star Wars. For most, this is an iconic image. Tatooine from Star Wars. George Lucas knew that parking two suns in the sky would tell us that we were not in Kansas anymore. Trouble is, we also are not on an inhabitable world. The gravitational mechanics in a binary system like this, and there are many binary systems out there, would give a planet in that system such violent extremes of weather. It would be lucky to harbor bacteria, nothing higher. And so, my science fictional world, supporting the evolution of higher life forms, would be orbiting a star which looked like the sun at a similar distance, with a similar big solitary moon, with gas giants farther out, with liquid water and continents. You need the big moon to stabilize the planet on its polar axis. Otherwise, well, it would wobble too much and again get into too violent weather conditions. Could the planet be a rocky planet, bigger or smaller than Earth? Much smaller, and you lose your atmosphere, as Mars is a lot bigger, and you get the hot ice problem, a layer of water with the physical properties of ice due to pressure, not cold, at the bottom of the oceans, transferring minerals and soils from the land below. And a high-gravity planet probably would not have mountain ranges. What a tragedy. So I fear it would just be a blue globe of sterile water, and no land above the hot ice layer. The best hypothesis about how life originated here was over many millennia around hydrothermal seas, and not hydrothermal vents on the seafloor, as had been hypothesized previously. So I'm dubious about life being able to evolve under these circumstances, though I'm not sure how massive our planet would have to be to behave this way. So Could a planet be twice as massive as Earth, but not 3x? Something else recently discovered was that the solar system formed with massive rock planets in the Mercury mass range. Then gravitational interactions between Jupiter and Saturn caused both of them to move inward, with Jupiter winding up in the current orbit, precipitating a hail of rocks and ice to bombard the inner solar system, enough to dislodge all the big ones in our planetary system. Then Jupiter and Saturn moved out to where they are now, and breaking the gravity link between them along the way, preventing her repetition of this deadly orbital dance. And the inner planets formed out of the debris caused by the sequence of events. No science fiction writer ever cooked up something as employable as this. But as the historian Sarah has observed, history does not have to be plausible. I don't know just how the astronomical community figure this out, but they have. And it is not. It was a Scientific American cover story of the previous year, so it may well be much more like for Goldilocks zone planets to be too big for life to evolve on them. But it gives us a reason to cherish the one we live on. Looks like it's way more special than US 50 science fiction readers or anyone else related or imagined. Statistically, the planets on which complex life could have developed, then asks one, what? That could be more or less water-land ratio. The continent could be lumped together as they were a few 100 million years ago, or disposed. A continent parked upon one and both poles would not be required, nor a pretty much land encircled ocean like to pull the ocean. Those with warmer climates would be okay generally. If all the land masses are clumped together, you could have a pretty flat, humid, tropic landscape on land with only a few mountains. And I guess it could be bigger to some extent, just not much smaller, and no gas giant satellites or too much radiation, gravitational violent weather, insufficient sunlight, and more. One other said, creating a fictional world can be a fascinating exercise. Agreed. Atheris is the planet located in a distant galaxy, characterized by a unique atmosphere that allows for the existence of floating islands, the oceans of reminiscent or fluorescent water, and rich tapestry of diverse ecosystems. The planet's gravitational anomalies create areas where gravity is weaker, allowing for the natural formation of floating land masses. What about floating land masses or islands? Well, varying in size and a home to various species. Each island has its own ecosystem, climate, and culture. Many oceans glowing with bioluminescent organisms, providing a vibrant underwater world that is explored by both the native inhabitants and visitors from other planets. Sky rivers, streams of liquid energy flow through the air, connecting islands and providing a means of transportation for the inhabitants. The Atherians, a humanoid species that has adapted to the unique environment of Atheres. They possess the ability to manipulate gravitational fields, allowing them to navigate the floating islands with ease. They are known for their deep connection to nature and their ability to communicate with the bioluminescent creatures of the ocean. And the Lumis, a semi-sentient species of bioluminescent creatures that inhabit the oceans. They play a crucial role in the ecosystem and are reviewed by the Aetherian for their wisdom and guidance. Technology and magic. Aetherians blend advanced technology with a form of magic derived from their understanding of energy manipulation. They use technology to enhance their natural abilities, creating devices that harness the energy of the sky rivers. Art and expression. Art is a vital part of Aetherian culture, with floating sculptures and light displays that interact with the environment. Music, even, is created using natural elements, resonating with the planet's vibrations. The balance of Aetherius is threatened by an external force, an advanced civilization seeking to exploit the planet's resources. This incursion forces the Aetherians and Lumis to unite and protect their home, leading to a struggle with their tests, their abilities, beliefs, and connections to each other and their world. Thomas answered, how would your fictional world differ from our current world if you were to create one? He wrote, I would be the man who yanked this sword so violently from the stone that I lifted them both over my head, then smashed the stone to pieces. I would be the king. I decide who lives, who gets whacked, and who gets stretched in public. Cars would remain on all day, every day, regardless if they are being used. The weather would be torrential or bone dry, hot and barren. Might would make it right. The tough guys who had to fight their way through life would live in the finest homes, with the nicest cars, and have the highest paying jobs. All the rich kids can start taking the bus. Any man owning an electric car will be forced to drive it into the ocean and be electrocuted. They were really only meant to be driven by women. Colleges, campus will be turned into supermax prisons. Enough with lawyers and politicians. Put them in jail. I would make the laws. How would I also be ridiculously handsome? Every other handsome man would have his face rearranged by my acolyte or a plastic surgeon. Every man would be required to serve 1 year in a maximum security prison, but they would get turned out a few times a day. This stands to humble men and keep everyone in their place. If anyone complained, they would get sent to prison too. Charming, didn't you say? Scott Morgan was asked, if you had the ability to make a fictional world too real, what would it be and why? And the answer was, a guy named Pierce Anthony wrote a series about a world of magic and the world of science that shared the same physical space but were out of phase with each other, called the Apprentice Adept series. A clever finds that he can be phasing out of his original science space album into a magic realm because his identical counterpart, a blue wizard, has died in this real world. Thank you. And he wrote further, I am both a science fiction and fantasy fan. I grew up on Star Trek, Star Wars, and Lord of the Rings. And the ability to be a wizard today, if I so truly chose, and a billionaire playboy, high-tech dude, the next appeals to me. The author was also a part of my childhood, as he wrote the children's book series, Shanth, based in Florida, housing and magical hidden realm where everything is magical. Yet, at face value, if you threw a coin in front of someone running past you, they would stop on a dime, literally. It's a very childish but very fun, with lots of current fantasy elements that have been around since and before. The term mundane is for people who lived in Florida, but not in Shant. But much like the Muggles from Harry Potter series, also they have lived in Mundania, where everything was bland and boring because there was no magic. Question was asked about how would people and the world be different if fiction did not exist? It's a good question. And let's explore the background for a moment, shall we? Workshop of fiction, wherein the stories that we used to explore, discover, play, ask questions, and develop ideas, looking at the world through new glasses, expanding our minds. With this in mind, we can see that there is more to this question than we realize. Works of fiction, the extensions of our creative mind and our desire to ask questions of what if. They are directly linked to what we think could happen in this situation and the way to explore consequences in a different way. We read works of fiction to escape reality, but see a reflection of it in another light. As Eve in the film V for Vendetta series states, artists use lies to tell you the truth. With that in mind, we can use this to answer the question. If we didn't have works of fiction, then we would have removed our ability to imagine. We would have literally removed our ability to ask the question, what if? And think of using a normal thing in a new way. Without works of fiction, the world would be very logical, but a lot more sterile. The reality is that a lot of technology has been directly linked to the works of fiction. Submarines, helicopters, self-opening doors are the first that come to mind. Without the human desire to come up with new ideas, we would only have logical progression, not the creative beasts that we have now. The world would have nothing to aspire to either, as there is no one who is the perfect example, as in King Arthur, who was my favorite when I was a kid. We would have literally no inspiration to keep us going. Without work of fiction, we would have a bland, mundane, grey world to live in. Fiction has given us inspiration and imagination. As Albert Einstein once said, I repeat, it is better to have a good imagination than a good intelligence, and logic will take you from A to B, but imagination will take you everywhere. The author Petrovich writes, looking into history, look at how the human condition was expressed and examined before the novel was a mechanism to explore it, and how the novel increased in the understanding of the human condition since it first happened. This is a marked difference between poetry and prose. Information can be passed in the poetry by the poet. Form in its main attribute is not in the information it presents, but more on the emotional feeling it creates out of the information conveyed. In novels, there is still the emotional connection by the reader. By the novel is prose, and it is all a convenience or conveyance of information specific to address the premise of that book. A poem will direct you into a certain feeling and conclusion, but the novel should leave the reader with questions and thoughts that will lead them to conclude through their own view on whether the premise or the idea behind the book was resolved or not. If novels were never written, information presented in any fashion would leave the reader less able to conclude an answer to a question without accepting the conclusion given to the reader. This can also be argued by going to isolated groups around the planet who possess no form of writing where information is passed down through stories and word of mouth. That, to a person listening and learning, is really not allowed to question. Otherwise, the initial information would then tend to be lost. Novels could then be seen as the written form of tribal-like stories that convey information meant never to be lost, but also permitting the reader or listener to question conclusions established within the prose. The novel states in the form it was completed, but then can become a living document through discussion of which contents are considered. Another author writes, "Without fiction, imagination would get restricted. Perceptions will become narrow, and people will stop believing in anything out of the box. People who read fiction are most of the times taken to a different world altogether. They travel in time, against time, and sometimes even beyond time. On the other hand, no fiction might make one more grounded to the reality. Truly real and living in reality, one definitely needs imagination and fictional idea before experimenting, testing, and even arriving at reality." Another question was asked: how would people and the world be different if works of fiction did not exist? What do you think? Answer given was, this would not be the human race that we know. We could have imagination without fiction and invention, and we could still lie. There would just be no entertainment or art based on storytelling. All stories would be based on real events and the people. All the things to imagine which were not yet real would involve no narrative. We would imagine new devices, but not a story in which someone used them. We could lie, but not invent a whole story from beginning to the end to get ourselves out of trouble. We could still have another kind of art and entertainment. We could have abstract things. We could have various forms of representation, but they would all be the real things. Possibly, we could imagine an unreal building or person to depict, but without any backstory. We could still write poetry. We could only not have non-fiction literature, but actually jazz it up with drama and politic expression. I guess there would be a lot of histories, biographies, travel guides, and documentaries in this world. Can you imagine that there is a species somewhere in the universe like this? But it is not ours, thankfully. I find it hard to imagine how the human race would have progressed over the millennia. There would have been no campfire stories to entertain people and teach the kids of the earliest days of hunter-gatherers. Well, they could tell genuine stories of their exploits and what their ancestors told them, but they could not tell what their ancestors would truly convey, things like fables, legends, fairy tales, cautionary tales. We would never had Scheherazade or Sinbad, Homer or Shakespeare, the tale of Genji or Don Quixote, James Joyce or Dan Brown. Can you imagine? How would people and the world be different if the works of fiction did not exist? The ability to fictionalize, to envision that which is not, it is far too closely linked to our ability to invent and to create. That means that our defining trait as a species, our intelligence, simply cannot exist without the ability to create fiction, even if nowhere but in our heads. So, if you remove from human beings the ability to create fiction, then what you are left with are not human beings, just hairy animals. Maybe we can ask people like Jehovah's Witnesses to answer it, as they do not allow even their children to have anything to do with science fiction. Ask them if they have allowed their children to watch Harry Potter. Then you see. One other question was asked: what would life be like without imagination? Bar Akiva explained it this way: imagination is making up things. It is manipulating what mental resources we already have to create a mental picture of something that does not exist, or at least it is not near proximity. Ideologies, prejudice, biases, ideas, they all stem from imaginations, provisions of what existed and what can exist. Without the ability to mend, bend, break, and rebuild, we are left with what we currently have. What could, as far as to say that since our vision is an edited version of what our eyes gather, vision is also imagination. One that sees without an ability to imagine can perceive the world as it really is. You could argue that there is not an objective truth, that everything is a perspective. Yet the closest we could get to an objective truth is by removing the human factor. Since the only thing that differentiates humans from beasts is the ability to intelligently create a biased consciousness, one could argue that lack of imagination is lack of humanity. And lack of humanity in sight is not true sight, but it is objective sight. Life without imagination is that you get what you see. Imagination for us is from what we were given, so we could bring what was not given in the beginning into present sight. If life and existence itself were a painting on a sheet of canvas, imagination is the paintbrush. Tolerance is providing the artist with fresh sheets if he messed up his creation or happened to get a really bad painting. But that is another topic. We'll talk about it. One other magnificent question was asked. How would religion and mythology affect works of fictions? Well, a Greek mythology enthusiast answered it this way. The first thing that came to mind was the tokens were generalizing greatly and attempting to reconcile Norse mythology with Catholic theology. So we had to kiss that goodbye. But the problem is far more expensive than that. The human society would have evolved in a fundamentally different way. Though I cannot imagine society developing in the absence of any kind of religion. At any rate, the kind of common understandings among humans, even things as basic as language, would be different. A lot of masterpieces just don't make sense without the context of religion in society, regardless of whether the author or reader is personally religious. Many works deal with man's struggle with fate, gods, and supernatural, which are all deeply tied to religion and mythology. Notions of people finding their place in the world would not exist if society did not have the idea of predestiny. Children's stories would basically be non-existent. Those are basically all mythology in their way. Fantasy also wouldn't be a thing. Fairy creatures and magic would draw no readers in interest. Question: what is the value of fiction? Well, Jessica Storm writes it this way. People have always loved stories. It was not that long ago that people had nothing to do after dark other than to tell stories to entertain themselves. Cavemen would use crushed mud and rock to paint picture stories on cave walls. In the Middle Ages, few people could read. Every book was handwritten, and someone with 5 books was considered a very learned man. We created means to make books faster, available to people who learned to read, and people started to write down the stories that had passed down for generations. By telling those stories are a part of history. Some are thousands of years old. Ancient kings and emperors were told these stories as children, and they may have learned early lessons from them. They may have even helped to form their beliefs and attitudes. Stories are a part of life. They express ideas and solve problems. They teach lessons. They bring us together. Even today, we gather around the TV and watch a movie with our friends or family. It's just another way to tell a story we discuss with others, a story that might spark an idea that becomes a reality. Creative minds feed other creative minds. No new idea became reality before someone first wrote it down. When you consider, you might think, or being told, you might be wasting your time by reading or watching science fiction. Think again. Well, I thank you for sharing this episode and watching, and we will meet you again by the next episode. Keep smiling and be happy. Thank you.